Kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching G-REG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Caplin. It's the most important thing, some say, many say, that keeps us away from anarchy. It's meant to keep us safe, but why does it sometimes work and why does it sometimes not? It is, of course, the law and those charged with enforcing it and those who have a say in how it's enforced and regulate in relation to it are hopefully watching this webcast. Our guest is very well placed because he takes, I suppose, a different approach to thinking about what makes laws work. And that's because he's Professor Benjamin van Rooij from the University of Amsterdam, who's co-authored with Adam Fine the Behavioural Code, which is a really groundbreaking book in his area of research, which is law and behaviour. We're lucky to have Benjamin here with us today. Now, Benjamin's punchy starting point is that most important coding of human conduct law in the book has been left to regulators and lawmakers. And I think, and I'm quoting fairly carefully, Benjamin, you described them as behavioural novices. Benjamin, kia ora and a very warm welcome to you. And thank you very much for joining us. Let's just kick off with that point about behavioural novices.
Well, thank you so much for having me. So what Adam and I meant with that is, I mean, first of all, what precedes that is saying that the most important mechanism that we as humans have developed to deal with unwanted behavior is the law. And that mechanism only works if somehow these rules that we write up on paper or in bits and bytes nowadays come to shape human conduct. And we've left most of that to people that have a law degree. They are the ones that are legal drafters in ministries. There are often also many people that are formerly lawmakers in parliament have law degrees. And also the ones that interpret and apply it, for instance, judges and also prosecutors. Often, or most of them, have law degrees. But if there's one thing a law degree doesn't train you in, it's really to understand the root causes of human conduct, which is a basic social science question. And we've sort of left that out of most legal teaching.
Yeah.
So that's what we mean by behavioral novices. And on the other hand, we see that the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a wealth of knowledge across the social and behavioral sciences, understanding sort of the root causes of human conduct that we can actually much better draw on. So the book is an argument in part to make the law more better behaviorally informed.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating read. I mean, I just look again. You use this, I think it's an image really of the words on the paper or the digital words that happen to be the law, but the translation into action is I think the book's thesis really the missing link on current thinking.
Yes, 100%. So we sort of assume, I think in the law, and I'm also a lawyer by training, we sort of assume that law works like a computer program. So we program it and we have these if A happens, then B happens. That's a very basic thing in basic computer languages. We sort of hope by getting the incentives right in the law that we can steer human conduct. And our book shows that a lot of these assumptions about if we write rules, they sort of get to shape conduct. The assumptions that we have in the law are not always correct, and that humans don't always respond the way to rules that we think they do.
I think the interesting thing, one of the many interesting things that really emanates from that, I think the book talks about the punishment delusion, and it's quite forgiving in the sense that it's saying, as I see it anyway, that the assumption that the law will effectively have an automatically coercive effect without more is wrong. And anyway, if it does work the first time and someone's locked up and that's the correct thing to do, it doesn't necessarily follow that they won't do it again. And it's almost as though you say really the secret is in the communication of the rule.
Yes, so punishment or negative incentives are a bread and butter of any legal system from ancient times, Hammurabi, till now. So it's one of the ways in which we as community societies have said, look, we make rules and we implement these rules. We're making sure that if people break them, we back them up by sanctions. It's a very old idea that we can find across the globe. That the idea that in order to change conduct, we set the rule. If people break it, we have a negative sort of response. And largely, we think that works because it creates fear, it creates deterrence. And in the chapter, The Punishment Delusion, we actually look at the empirics of what proof is there that stricter punishment in of itself will reduce breaking of rules. And we find that for many things that we make rules for instance, violent crime or corporate crime, there is no such evidence. So there's no conclusive evidence that stricter punishment in of itself reduces crime in these areas. There is some for non-violent sort of offenses, traffic violations and things like that. So that means that one of the basic assumptions we have in law that stricter punishment in of itself reduces illegal behavior or unwanted behavior is not always true. What we do know, and that's what the chapter shows, is that, first of all, there can be a deterrent effect only if there's sufficient certainty of getting caught and punished. So that's very important. So policing or detection or inspections in the regulatory domain are very important. Second, we know, as you just said, that communication of this is very important. So it's all about the perception of the punishment, not the actual punishment. So here it's really important to make sure that there's sufficient communication. So a good example, positive example that the book discusses is the Dutch tax authorities. So in the Netherlands, the chances of being caught and punished for individual tax offenses is rather low. And also the severity of punishment is rather low. There's quite a high deterrent effect. Why? Because people don't perceive the chances of being caught and the actual punishment of being low. That's the best situation you can have as a regulator or as a law enforcement. And that actually comes out of a policy where you try and communicate. For instance, they perp walked a former Dutch soccer coach of our national team for individual tax evasion, Guus Hiddink, who also was later coached in Korea, I think even in Australia. They perp walked him from his house at 5 a.m. That sort of send a message to everybody in the Netherlands, oh, he gets caught, everybody can get caught. So it's these type of things. To say one last thing about punishment. So our book is not against punishment, but it shows the different ways in which punishment does and doesn't work. Deterrence is one of them, but we actually recognized at least 18 different effects punishment can have on behavior. And there's about 8 of these are positive, about 10 of these are negative. So it's really about how do you combine, how do you organize punishment in such a way that it enhances the positive effects that reduce unwanted behavior and reduce the unwanted effects where it actually stimulates more wrongdoing.
And I think linked to all that is a level of science that the book is highly critical of, in that it says that effectively lawmakers, legislators, the political drivers and others equate their gut feelings as a proxy for scientific evidence of what works and what should work. So in a sense, perhaps those who go by the gut would say, communication is key, certainty is key, but it's more the intuitive instinct that governs what I suggest the effectiveness of a law is. Whereas you're saying, no, social science is the key.
Yes. So this is what psychologists call moral coherence. What we feel is morally justified, we also think is effective. So studies psychologists did about waterboarding, which is not a very effective way to get intelligence, or capital punishment, for which there's no conclusive proof that it deters homicide. People will, if they think it's justified morally, are more inclined to think that it also is effective. And we sort of try and warn people about this sort of thing that they sort of jump to conclusions. The problem with all of this is that we've been able to chase, and we don't detail this in the book, but I've written it up elsewhere. These are very ancient ideas that we've developed as humans. So we find them in ancient Greek writing, in the Old Testament and Quran, but also in ancient India and China. We really find if you have bad behavior by bad people, the only thing that works is strong punishment, because it will provide pain to these people. And when others learn about this, they will refrain from this. And this may have worked in these small societies with a small subset of rules, where every violation was clearly visible, where people were caught, where the punishment was meted out so that everybody could see, where there was also a sort of community sense behind the rules and support for the rules. But nowadays, with the amount of rules we have, the complexity of the behavior that we're looking at, the low chances of being caught, for instance, for corporate crime, some of these things just don't apply anymore. So yes, we argue for a science-based approach where we try and go beyond the gut feeling. And we have some good news there that's not in the book. We've done experiments recently where we show if we show these scientific insights to a general population, they start to support policy decisions that are much more in line with the science, regardless of their political orientation. So in the US, we could even get conservatives to support policies that are not purely punitive if they learn about the sort of science we were just discussing about punishment.
Very interesting. So in a sense, we're governed by ancient signals which are understandable and intuitive, but out of date. Social science needs to be there effectively to ourselves. Or flipping it another way, the paradox, I think, that what you're writing about sets up, and certainly what the book sets up, is the assumption of a rational connection between the way laws are currently drafted, regulations currently dealt with, and their effect. And I think you use the example of Haidt's elephant, and everybody's saying, well, all those who are framing the laws would say, well, we're the riders of the elephant. And you're actually saying, no, you're the elephant in the room, effectively. Can you explain that kind of metaphor a little more? Because I found it fascinating.
Sure. So here we draw some of the insights from social psychology and behavioral economics about to what extent people are actually always making these sort of deliberative decisions. And cognitive science has shown that, well, people actually operate through these two types of systems in their brains. So there's the rider, which is the rational side, is so how we see ourselves. And then there's the elephant that the rider is riding, which is more the intuitive, emotional side that often takes over, especially when these are more automated, non-deliberative types of behavior. And this has two implications. One is that we can't assume sort of the rational weighing of costs and benefits that has been assumed sometimes in people who sort of develop these sort of models that have been driving some of the legal design that we have. It also opens up a new sort of area where we can try and have interventions where we try and move directly more to this automated side of humans. And this has been, I think, popularized a lot in the behavioral units that have popped up in different governments, like in the UK. Yeah. The book does discuss the limits of this. So we don't propagate a sort of behavioral approach to law as just being this. I think this is also in the problem in the field. Sort of it has been driven by behavioral economics, which has sort of said, well, this big insight from cognitive science, that's it, and we can now nudge people into compliance. Yeah. What our book says is, the sort of research behind this cognition, the interventions here it's still cutting edge, and because of that, quite shaky. So some of the big studies here don't replicate well. Some of the studies on willpower, on primes, they don't replicate well. There's been some data fabrication, which is obviously very, very problematic. But for me, the biggest problem is it also doesn't really generalize well. So it's hard to sort of generalize and translate findings from labs or sort of simple type of behavior to the complex things. I don't know how to nudge somebody out of violent crime. I don't know how to nudge somebody out of willful corruption. I don't know how to nudge a big polluting factory to pollute less. In order to get to these more complex questions, we need to draw on the broad behavioral and social sciences. And that's what our book does. It includes some of the behavioral economics, but also really goes into the sociology, into the broader criminology, especially, of some of these issues.
So it's broader than nudge. I mean, it's a totally different way of looking at this problem of laws, if I can put it this way, that don't quite cut it. But I guess what you're saying, Benjamin, is classic nudge theory works on the basis of kind of one-off results and also making regulation mandatorily more fun to be effective. I mean, I think there's some very popular examples like insects painted on the loo somewhere. Whereas I think it's more with behavioural code, as you posited, it's more actually, no, it's hard work and you have to look more broadly.
Well, I think the real difference, and this is also the difference between current political thinking, current legal thinking, and I would also say the thinking in this sort of, what I would say, more narrow behavioral approach, difference with what we're propagating, we're not studying the solution and we're not jumping towards the solution. Rather, we're trying to understand the root causes of the behavioral problem through a series of questions that allow then to think, okay, what is the best set of interventions? I think mostly what we've seen so far is either studies of punishment or incentives, studies of nudges, or studies of certain compliance management systems. These are all jumping to the conclusion of the intervention. And what we're saying is, look, actually behavior is multifaceted, and the approach to the behavior may also draw on different aspects that are the root causes of the behavior, rather than just saying, okay, well, this is the best thing to do always. We don't believe that exists.
No, and I guess the way that you boil it down as much as it's possible to do with all those variables in mind is, of course, the 6 steps how to make a behavioural code as a law work. We're going to have a quick canter through the 6 steps. Now, the first one, behavioural variation. That's the one that the book starts with in terms of what variation is there in the unwanted behaviour. How vital is that variation?
Yes. So this is exactly, we included this as our first step in order to sort of get over this sort of quick fix mentality that I think exists so much in practice, which is, well, we did something for A, we can just roll it out for everything that looks like A.
And that's a critical point, actually, isn't it? Because that's what I think you say distinguishes your approach from other approaches.
Yes. Yes. So it's all about making sure you actually understand the behavior that exists and that you understand what types of this behavior are there. Very stupid but exaggerated example to illustrate this is homicide.
Yeah.
There's one legal category for homicide. But there's a really big difference between a passion killing and a hit that was orchestrated on somebody else.
Yeah.
The way to address them is also very different. Whether somebody's doing a passion killing in the spur of the moment, even if it has some premeditated aspects to it, so that still fits the sort of homicide legal sense, there's probably much more emotion going on. There's probably much more hormones going on. There's probably other things that are going on. So the approach there probably requires very different questions than, let's say, something that somebody has been hired to kill somebody else. So and you can apply that to many different things. Let's say you're dealing with tax evasion, many different kinds of tax evasion. Or when you're dealing with industrial pollution, again, it's a difference when you're dealing with a very big factory or a small factory. The bigger factory may have all the capacity and the technology, etc., in place. The smaller factory may actually be a question that they don't know very well. So with all these things, it's important to sort of categorize the behavior, and then for each of them to sort of then go through the other steps. And each of these steps then gets you to the heart of what are the underlying causes.
And I think step number 2 is very linked with that, because it's really getting to grips with the how rather than the why of the regulated behavior, isn't it? And you use a very powerful example in the terrorism context in your book.
Yes. So the second question is to understand how the behavior took place in order to find out, are there aspects of the behavior we can actually make more difficult?
Yes.
And this is an important thing. Very often, this is not just in the regulatory sphere or even in the legal sphere, but I think also in the public domain. We're always asking, when we're talking about unwanted conduct, especially about violent crime, why did they do this? This is interesting, of course. It tells an interesting story. But to get to motivate people to behave better is a more difficult thing than making it harder for them to behave factually and practically. So this requires a how question, and we put that as the second question, because if you can make the behavior harder, you don't really need to get to motivation very much. So yes, we use the example of terrorists. So this is the liquid bomb attack. There was a plot that 10 people were involved in trying to blow up, or several people were involved in to blow up 10 planes simultaneously by smuggling in liquid bombs, liquid explosives. Fortunately, authorities in England were able to find it out and to prevent it from happening. And of course, because of that, because they found this out, they found, oh wow, there's a new avenue towards terrorism. They then closed that off by having these new rules that are quite simple, that you can't bring any liquid on a plane above a certain amount, and that all the liquids need to be screened. So that's a very simple way. Of course, we also see it in traffic. We have these speed bumps. If a speed bump is high enough, you can't speed unless you're driving a monster truck. But the idea is sort of, okay, how do we find other sort of speed bumps for other types of violations? So another example we discussed where this is not being done is cell phone usage in cars. It's sort of interesting that I think it was in Australia, the authorities were very proud that they installed these cameras that can look into cars and use AI to sort of automatically detect whether people are using their phone. Great that they're doing that.
Yeah.
But it sort of requires then an ex post, and they need to fine it, then they need to scare people out of using it. Well, if you look at it, why are people using phones? Often it's very automated. Often this is not a conscious decision. We're addicted to it. And if you look deeper into your phone, for instance, if you use Spotify, if it's in a car, automatically turns to a safe mode.
Yes.
So it detects itself that you're driving, and it switches to a safe mode. Apple actually earlier already developed this as part of it's in your phone as software, developed a patent for this. Yeah. And actually the patent said that the phone would be safer because it would detect its driving, could switch it itself off. Then later a court case was done against Apple, where parents of a deceased youth who died because of distracted driving sued Apple because it never forced the phone to actually use this. So here's an approach for regulators. Regulators could mandate that phones in cars can always switch to safe mode.
Yeah.
Even better, there's a small, which we also describe, a small device. I think it costs like $100. You can put it in your cigarette lighter and it will disable phone usage in the driver's seat. So there's these technological ways which we can actually make driving much safer, where we don't need to get the human and the choice involved. Obviously, the downside to all of this is freedom. That's also why it's not always used. The prime example here is guns. Most countries, like the Netherlands, of course, Australia is a prime example after Port Alexander, have banned guns or have placed large restriction on guns. But if you look in the US, the political domain, which we also do in the book, the key argument that we could find against the stronger regulation of guns is freedom. And of course, I'm for regulating guns, so I'm not convinced by that argument. But I think in general, the argument against sort of the approach to reduce the ability to engage in unwanted conduct, we have to take serious the costs and benefits of the reduction of freedom. I think that is a big question.
And I think what's linked to that is the way that your analysis pivots to the next step, which is having looked at how the regulations effectively could work, is no, let's take a look at what people actually need in order to refrain from their behavior. It's almost quite an altruistic stance, isn't it? It's a pragmatic one, but it's saying, what is it that really makes this work? What is it they need?
Yes, and so the important thing is the how question can get us to really effective prevention, but it's limited because we can't always use it. And that's why we need all the other things. First step indeed is to understand the capacity people have for a law-abiding, good behavior, a sort of lifestyle. Yeah. And there the research, shows several things. One is a bombshell for law and regulation. Most people don't know most rules. If you just let that sink in. When we're designing these rules, and I know that I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor, I teach law. So we're always about, okay, if we write it out this way or that way, it'll do this. Well, actually, most people don't know most rules. And with the explosion of the amount of rules we have and the complexity that they have, this is not surprising. We can't expect that people know what is expected of them every day every day. Even though it's not an excuse to break rules, it is a reason people end up breaking rules. So a good example we show in the book is from the corporate world. The latest date I have some numbers for is in the late 1990s. By then, a US company already had to comply with 300,000 rules backed up by criminal sanctions. Just think about it. You're a CEO or the main decision maker in a company, and you want to, in your everyday life, make decisions that are compliant with 300,000 rules. You hire 30 lawyers. Each of these lawyers then has to know 10,000 rules and be able to communicate them to you, which both is impossible. So this shows a major shortcoming of our sort of legal approach, which is sort of we assume that if we write these rules, people know them. So a better approach is to sort of say, okay, what are the rules we can actually that are so important people should know them? How do we prioritize in this knowledge? How do we disseminate the knowledge that people then should know? So that's the first aspect of this.
I guess linked to all of that is, if the CEO hasn't, surprise, read all 300,000 of the rules, how is it? Step 4 is really, do people think that the rules are legitimate, the ones that they know about, or at least the spirit and intent of them? So legitimacy is a really big plank in your thinking, isn't it, Benjamin?
Yes, it is. It is definitely there. It's also one where there's a clear win-win. So there's a clear win-win. We can have procedurally more fair, fairly made, and fairly enforced rules, and have less rule violation. The prime example where this can be applied is in the criminal justice sphere, especially in jurisdictions where there is police violence, police misconduct, where there may be wrongful convictions, where there may be prosecutorial misconduct or even judicial misconduct. All of these things will not just have harms towards people that are the victim of these miscarriages of justice. They will also cause more crime. So this is a clear win-win. But we can also apply it more broadly to the regulatory sphere. If rules are made by regulators and enforced in ways that are procedurally fair, so where it's clear, for instance, that relevant parties have been able to participate in the rulemaking, or where rules are made and enforced in a way that's neutral and balanced, that will more likely create more compliance. That's a very important thing. And it sort of taps in what we call the general duty to obey rules. People are more likely to obey rules regardless of how they're enforced, regardless of what others are doing, simply because they deem these rules to be legitimate. And that depends, again, on whether they're made and enforced in a procedurally fair manner.
And I guess the connected point to that is really your step 5 and 6, which I believe is sort of more norms and morals, the overlay and the connectedness between whether it's A, legitimate, and B, whether it accords with a general moral sense in the community.
Yes. So a really vital thing to understand about any behavior is to sort of understand to what extent is it rooted with social norms and personal morals people have. If the majority of the people have social norms or personal morals that stand opposed to the law, you have to be extra careful. If that's the case, you can very easily communicate in a certain way that activates these negative social norms and morals. So a good example is for instance, in the Netherlands, we had this new rule against using your phone on your bike.
Yeah.
Distracted bicycle riding. And everybody was doing it. And it was very normal, especially in the countryside where I live, where you have these long bicycle roads. I mean, they're like little bicycle highways. You can quite safely, if you're a Dutch person, because we know how to bike quite well, be on your phone and bike. And people think that's normal. Then when the ban came, the first year, a lot of people, not surprisingly, were caught and punished for using the phone on their bike. Then the authorities at the end of the year, they published a report saying that 300,000 Dutch people had been caught and punished for riding unsafely on their bike. That sends a deterrent message. That's great. If you do it, you're going to get caught. But it also shows, and that's where the negative part comes in. We know through research that this is indeed negative, that a lot of people are still doing it, and that it's very normal.
Yeah, yeah.
So a better way to do this would have been to just advertise some famous people, individuals that have been caught and punished, while also showing how normal it's becoming that people are not using their phone on their bicycle. The flip side of this, and that's the positive side, is when there are positive norms that are supporting compliance with the law, you want to put the focus on them.
Yeah.
You want to show that this is happening, and you also want to be careful that you don't undermine them through incentives. So we know there can be so-called crowding out effects, where if you bring the law in a situation where people already have the right morals and norms, it actually may make people think, well, if I had been doing this all the time because I think it's the right thing to do, but now all of a sudden I see that others rules are made that make this illegal and that people are punished for not doing it, it can undermine, some studies find, people's own sort of normative views on this and sort of make them feel that they don't have to do it unless they get punished. So it's sort of
almost yes,
yeah.
almost a moral hazard point that can arise out
Yes.
of it.
Yes.
And I think that's where I guess we find ourselves at the final piece, which is motivations and incentives, which is effectively your rule 6. Some of this, I think, deals with what we've discussed, which is, is it worth it to people? What happens if not? And some of it's really about evidential purity. What about other things creeping into the analysis? And you touched on that earlier as well.
So we sort of put as final step the step that's often the first step, which is the incentives that the law makes. Positive and negative, punishment, rewards, etc. Once you know everything we've discussed so far, you can better program these things. You can better get incentives that fit the variation, that may back up sort of a reduction of practical opportunities, be in line with capacities. I mean, sometimes these incentives reduce people's capacities to comply with the law. So some sorts of punishment, for instance, make it harder for people after prison, for instance, to find jobs, which is very hard for them to lead abiding lives. Also to have punishments or incentives that are aligned with these social norms and that are developed in a way that's legitimate. Once you understand all that, then you can say, okay, within that context, what are then the right incentives? Our book is not a call against incentives. It's a call for smart incentives that are actually based on the surrounding environment.
Yeah, and they go in a fascinating way, if I may say so, to the settings in which the law is created, but also I think for the regulators watching this program who have the laws to apply and have a level of executive discretion as to how they're applied, for the way that regulators regulate within those parameters too. So it's very multi-layered, isn't it?
Yes, that's the whole idea of the book, and that's why I said earlier that we. I mean, sometimes people ask me, "Oh, behavioral code, that's like behavioral economics for law." Like, no, it's not. It's the broader multi-layered. We don't have. I mean, you can't read the book and say, "Oh, I should do this."
Yeah.
You read the book and you know which questions you have to answer in order to find out what the multiple things are that you can try to do to improve gradually, rather than a quick fix that will solve all your problems. I don't believe that exists. If I did, we would have been able to write the new Bible.
That's beautifully put. Yes, I remember we had that conversation offline, and I guess with that in mind, how much of a holy grail has it been to regulators, or perhaps I put it slightly different, what has been the response by regulators to the book since it was published? It went out in 21, didn't it?
Yeah, so it came out in 21, still in the midst of COVID.
Yeah.
I think the great thing for us, so we originally hoped to reach a general audience. And the reason we wanted to reach a general audience is that before I started on the book, I already was often in contact with people in companies and people in government. And I often saw the same thing. I saw people in companies saying, look, we know that we should be doing a more holistic and broader approach, but regulators ask us just to check the boxes X. Then I will talk with regulators and they will say, well, especially since the financial crisis, we are very pressured to take a more stern approach, an approach that's sort of not holistic and that really politically forces us to do X. And you see the same in the criminal justice domain. A lot of different actors know that the causes of crime are complex. But we saw these punitive approaches, they're coming back every now and again. And even if we had this sort of de-incarceration movement in the US and sort of questions about police brutality, we didn't see a fundamental change in thinking about what are the causes of crime and how to reduce them. Internally, they existed with government officials, both regulatory and criminal justice, as well as people in the private domain. But we saw that sort of the political sphere around this wasn't ready for it. That's why we tried to reach a public audience. And I have to say, we didn't really succeed in that. We got some op-ed pieces in, but we didn't get the big book reviews in the big newspapers. So that's fine. It's still out there. It's still written in a style that I think any interested reader could read it. The great news has been that, yes, both in the private sector and the governmental regulatory sector, We have seen in the US, UK, England, Australia, now also New Zealand, there's been interest in the book. I think it has aligned with what people in government have already been developing. I think the great thing is that many regulators have developed these behavioral teams, so don't have these behavioral experts that will guide the behavioral novices. And what I've seen so far is that people are open to this sort of approach that's a little broader than sort of the behavioral approaches that have been more dominant earlier, I think.
So it's a case for better behaviour. Benjamin, thank you very much indeed. From Benjamin and I, thank you very much. Kakite.
Thank you so much.